Hello and welcome to the Femur and Pelvic Girdle unit. Remember, last semester in Procedures 1, in Chapter 6, we learned the lower limb, specifically the foot, the lower leg, and the distal femur. In this chapter, Chapter 7, we'll learn the proximal femur and the pelvic girdle. We'll also discuss the joints of the femur and the pelvic girdle, so specifically the hip joint, the sacroiliac joint, and the pubic symphysis joint of the pelvis. So let's get started. So as you may remember, the femur, seen here, is the longest and strongest bone in the body. The entire weight of the body is transferred through the femur and the joints at each end, the hip joint and the knee joint. As a result, the hip joint, of course found at the proximal end of the femur, is a frequent source for pathology when trauma occurs. So think about an elderly patient that falls. The proximal femur is a common place of fracture. We'll discuss pathology, of course, in more detail in another lecture. So let's first begin by discussing the proximal femur. And the proximal femur is made up of 4 different parts: the head, the neck, the greater trochanter, and the lesser trochanter. And notice this is an anterior view and this is a posterior view. Okay? The head of the femur is proximal, of course. It's round and smooth and it articulates with the pelvis. And we'll talk more about that articulation in a little while. The femoral head contains a depression near the center called the fovea capitis, and you can see that here. Notice the fovea capitis is better visualized from the posterior aspect of the femoral head than from the anterior. Now you don't need to write this down, but there's actually a ligament that attaches there. It's called the capitis femoris. And that ligament attaches to the femoral head at that fovea capitis point. Okay, so the neck of the femur, seen here anteriorly and here posteriorly, is a strong piece of bone that connects the head of the femur to the body. And that connection is made in the region of the trochanters. Okay, so the neck connects to the body near the region of the trochanters. Let's talk about those trochanters. The greater trochanter is a large prominence located superiorly and laterally to the femoral shaft or body. Remember, the greater trochanter is actually palpable, and we can use that as a landmark to help us locate the level of the pubic symphysis. The lesser trochanter is a smaller eminence that projects medially and posteriorly from the junction of the neck and the body of the femur. Now, one last thing about trochanters. Notice they're joined in the back of the femur or posteriorly by a ridge called the intertrochanteric crest. So this crest or ridge connects the trochanters and it's best visualized posteriorly. Good, okay. There are several angled relationships that I need you to be aware of, okay? So first, let's start by talking about the angle of the femoral neck to the body of the femur. So I'm going to refer to this first diagram here. Notice this dotted line is referring to the angle of the femoral body. This dotted line is referring to the angle of the femoral neck. So on an average adult, this angle between these two lines is approximately 125 degrees. And that can vary plus or minus 15 degrees depending on the width of a patient's pelvis and the length of their lower limbs. So for example, if you have a person with long legs and a narrow pelvis, this angle is going to be greater, approximately 140 degrees, for example. Because in a person with a narrow pelvis and a long femur, that femur is going to be closer to vertical. Now notice this dotted line is meant to represent the vertical plane. So if the patient's pelvis is more narrow, that's going to swing this femur closer to vertical. Okay, if you have a shorter person with a wider pelvis, they're going to have less angle, because remember, a wider pelvis, that's going to bring this dotted line more medial, and this angle will be smaller then, maybe 110, 115 degrees. Okay, so thinking about this concept a little bit more, on an average adult in anatomical position, the longitudinal plane of the femur is approximately 10 degrees from vertical. So this is the relationship that I just discussed. This is the vertical plane. This is the plane of the body of the femur. Notice it's about 10 degrees from vertical, but that's going to vary depending on the width of the patient's pelvis. So on a shorter person with a wide pelvis, the femur is closer to 15 degrees from vertical. On a tall person with a narrow pelvis, the femur is only about 5 degrees from vertical. And these angles are important to understand because they can affect our positioning and specifically our central ray angle that we use on our lateral knees. Okay, the second angle that I want you to be familiar with is the angle of the neck and the head of the femur. So let's look at this diagram here. So notice this dotted line refers to the plane of the femur, or the body or shaft of the femur, and this dotted line refers to the angle of the head and the neck. Okay, notice the head and the neck of the femur sit 15 to 20 degrees anteriorly in relation to the body of the femur. And again, this angle becomes important for positioning because when you x-ray a hip, you actually have to rotate the lower legs in 15 to 20 degrees because we want, notice the femoral neck right now is not parallel to the image receptor. If we roll this leg in 15 to 20 degrees, it's going to place this neck closer to parallel to the image receptor. Okay, and we'll look at examples of that on x-ray in lab. All right, the pelvis. Let's talk about the pelvis in a little more detail. So the pelvis connects the trunk and the vertebral column of the body to the lower limbs. The pelvis consists of 4 different bones. So you have 2 hip bones. These are also called ossa coxae or inanimate bones. You also have the sacrum and a coccyx. So these 4 bones make up a pelvis. Okay? Of course, the sacrum connects superiorly with the 5th lumbar vertebrae right here. So again, it connects, the pelvis connects the vertebral column to the lower extremities. And that connection between L5 and the sacrum forms the L5-S1 joint space. And we'll learn sacrum and coccyx in the next unit, so we'll talk about that joint space more in the next unit. The right and left hip bones articulate with the sacrum to form the sacroiliac joints, right here and here. And we'll talk more about those coming up as well. Okay, next, you've heard me say the word hip bones. Let's talk more about what that means, hip bone. Each hip bone is composed of 3 divisions: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So notice ilium is green, ischium is kind of a purple, and pubis is blue. Interestingly, in a child, these 3 divisions are actually separate bones. They are 3 different bones, which is so cool, but they fuse into one solid bone around the middle teens age. The fusion of the 3 bones occurs in this area called the acetabulum, and you can kind of see the division here where that fusion is taking place. Again, the fusion of the 3 hip bones occurs around the mid-teens age. The acetabulum is a deep cup-shaped cavity that articulates with the head of the femur, and that actually forms the hip joint. The ilium, which is the largest of the 3 divisions, is located superior to the acetabulum. So you can see the ilium here is the largest of the three bones, makes up the top of the acetabulum. The ischium is inferior and posterior to the acetabulum, and the pubis is inferior but anterior. So we're going to pause here. In part 2, we'll discuss each part of the hip bone in more detail.